Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Bradford Hill seminar series and to our first seminar in the series for now what is nearly 2 years. My name is Dr. Tom Burgoyne. I'm based at the MRC Epidemiology Unit, which is a department of the University of Cambridge. And on behalf of the Bradford Hill Seminar Series Organising Committee, I'd just like to say thank you to so many of you for joining us today. A warm welcome to those of you joining us from outside of Cambridge, perhaps as a result of this being our first seminar to be broadcast live online. We're trying to make the most of that opportunity. But as the principal joint seminar series of the Cambridge Population Health Sciences Partnership, a special welcome also to those students in the audience who are enrolled in the University of Cambridge's new Population Health Sciences MPhil programme. So some housekeeping notes just quickly. First of all, our speaker has kindly agreed to leave time for questions at the end of his talk, but please leave them in the chat as and when they come to you throughout. Please also indicate whether you'd like to be able to ask your question in person. If you don't tell me that, I'm happy to ask to read your question out to Robert on your behalf. You'll notice that your video is turned off and that you can't turn your video on. That is intentional. You'll also not be able to unmute yourself. We'll be recording today's lecture, but not the question and answer session at the end. So the Bradford Hill Seminar Series has always been home to a broad programme of internationally recognised speakers covering a wide range of topics of interest to the public health community. And with that said, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Robert J. Sampson. So Professor Sampson is the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, and he's joining us early in the day today from the US. He's an affiliated research professor at the American Bar Foundation and founding director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. Before moving to Harvard, Professor Sampson was based at the University of Chicago for 12 years, where he was scientific director for the project on human development in Chicago Neighbourhoods. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he's also served as president of the American Society of Criminology. So you're not here to hear from me, but Professor Sampson's research has covered a variety of topic areas, including crime, disorder, the life course, neighbourhood effects, inequalities, and the structure of the city. He's the author of 3 award-winning books, including this one, Great American City, if I get it out of the blur. And I've been telling anyone who listen about this book for the best part of a decade now. And so for me personally, but for us all, it's an absolute thrill that today Robert will be speaking to some of that work, its legacy, and some more works in progress in his lecture, Neighbourhood Disadvantage, Everyday Urban Mobility and Wellbeing. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and then Robert, you should be able to, you should be able to share already, actually.
Okay.
So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Tom. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you across the pond. As Tom noted, it's early here, but I have my coffee and ready to go. What I'd like to do is present some research today that joins several topics rather than present one specific paper, as is common, I guess, in a workshop. What I'd like to do is to sketch really the results of several papers, especially recent papers, on the theme of the title, Neighborhood Disadvantage, Everyday Urban Mobility and Well-being. But I'd also like to sketch the contours of a large-scale project that I've been working on really for the last 25 years or so that connects to the Neighborhood Project. And so I'm really going to try to do 2 things, or actually 3. Give you the sense of the project. And one of the reasons, by the way, is that it may be that some of the data are unfamiliar to many of you. And I think, and the PIs think, there's a lot of interesting data. Much of it is public and has been public for years, and we're going to be making additional information public. So in the sense of a data source that may be of use. So I'll talk about that, then I'll talk about the Neighborhood Disadvantage Project. And then if there's time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the really most recent stuff on life course and social change. So let me see if I can start this up here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Just the title slide. Okay, great. So
we can actually see the presenter for you though, Robert, rather than the slideshow view. So we can see your next slide as well as your current slide.
Okay, so what I will do then is to How's that?
I can't see your slide at all at the moment.
Okay, now I just lost it. Let me bring it back up again.
There we go. That's it.
That's it. Okay, yeah. Screen share is always tricky. All right. So the project is the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. And really the thesis, in a way, of the project is in the title. It's about human development in the life course and also neighborhoods. This started in 1995, and it's been continuing on to the present. Let me just give you a sense of the PhD design, because it's important for understanding the kinds of data and the results. It was very much a theoretically motivated design. It started out as a longitudinal study of over 6,000 children. It was 3 waves. What's important here is that it's a sequential cohort design, or what's often referred to as an accelerated longitudinal design. We enrolled at birth an infant cohort, which is unusual in the social sciences. So literally at ages 8, kids born in 1995. And then 3-year intervals all the way out to age 18. So we had 7 age cohorts, diverse probability sample by race and class, and detailed assessments. So I won't get into that. We also did a longitudinal study of neighborhoods over the same period of time, 1995 to 2002. We conducted surveys, systematic social observations, one of my favorite parts of the neighborhood study, and a social network study. 2 additional waves that you may not know as much about were conducted in 2012, and just last November, NORC at the University of Chicago completed a 5th wave of data. And we're now calling this PHDCN plus, because what this is a random sample of the original infant cohort, ages 8, 0, 9, 12, and 15. So 4 cohorts randomly sampled and followed wherever they moved, actually in the world. We also conducted detailed criminal history and census records over a 25-year period. So basically we know for every year where they lived. We can match in census data. We also know their complete criminal history throughout that time. Just to give you a feel for the geographic layout, on the left is the clustered stratified design. This is not just a study of the poor. It's not just a study of minorities or whites. It is a study of the diversity of kids that were living in Chicago. And I would say actually really representative of much of urban life in the United States. These are the 80 neighborhood clusters. You can see Black, white, Hispanic, mixed, low income, median income, high income. So we have middle and high income African-American neighborhoods, low income mixed neighborhoods, and so forth. I'm excited about this map because we just produced it. This is from our data that just came in. You can see, and each dot is a person. People have now started to spread outside of Chicago, particularly to the northwest, west, south, into Indiana, north into Wisconsin. So we have a sample now that's really starting to diffuse, and actually diffusing across the United States. Most stayed in Chicago, the vast majority, but nonetheless, you can see kind of a return migration down the Mississippi, many to Texas, Florida, East Coast, Denver, Los Angeles, Phoenix, kind of what you would expect, actually. There's a sort of face validity, at least to my mind, to the distribution. We've matched in geocoded XY locations and are now entering census data up to the present. So the result here, I'd like to show you pictorially, because this will come back to, I think, help understand some of the design. The life course or accelerated longitudinal design allows us to look at how kids are aging through different historical and social moments. So in the red, in the middle where my cursor is, 1995 is the enrollment. So we have birth, literal prospective birth cohort, and the 9, 12, 15-year-olds aging through to, at present, the infant cohort's about 25, 26. The other cohorts are in the mid-30s to early 40s, and wave 5 just completed. At the top, you can see the social changes that occurred. So at the same age, kids are coming into or coming of age in into very different social worlds, and I'll have more to say about that later. It's a unique type of design that allows us to link the macrosocial with individual developmental change. So a quick note now on just some of the neighborhood concepts and findings. I'm going to skim through this pretty fast, at least the beginning, because these are, quote, older findings, but I think somewhat important. We've published on what we've called collective efficacy, which is the linkage of social cohesion in a neighborhood with expectations for informal social control, the activation of social control. The key here was that we're using individuals not so much to ask them about themselves, but as informants about neighborhood and social conditions with a clustered community survey. A key here is that we can then develop reliable and valid measures to examine parameter variance at the neighborhood level. We published an article on what we call ecometrics. You can think of it as a metric for the study of ecology. And the idea here was to develop a systematic statistical framework for assessing when you can and how you can develop reliable and valid measures. The theory of collective efficacy was laid out in my book. I'm not going to say much about it here. The notion was that we viewed it as a mediating mechanism that helps explain some of the effects of structural features such as concentration of disadvantage, network ties and organizations, and how it both indirectly and directly is related to violence, disorder, but it's also been used to study health, cognitive skills, economic mobility. I'm not going to get into the findings here. Suffice it to say that we've put a lot of work into this, taking into account things like selection into neighborhoods. You can see in the bottom left, individual characteristics matter, but state and city and federal policies affect how neighborhoods are organized. Both theoretically and empirically, we've tried to take that into account. But what I want to emphasize is that in Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect, at the end of the book, in the last section, I laid out the idea of neighborhood networks and the higher order structure of the city. And what I mean by this is that ties across neighborhoods create a kind of structure. What I'm showing here is actually very simple. The circles are the neighborhoods in Chicago. And since we had longitudinal data, we follow people where they moved. If I move from neighborhood A to neighborhood B, I'm establishing a connection. And if you start to concatenate and build up and look at flows across neighborhoods, you can start to think about neighborhoods in a network sense, that is neighborhoods as nodes. This is residential mobility ties. I also looked at informational ties across the neighborhood. And the idea of higher order structure, this was 2012, we really started to push this further in recent work. And what I want to do now is to move beyond just residential mobility and think about everyday urban mobility. And I'm going to see if I can give you if this works. And I think, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's see if this works. What you're going to see is a person in Boston living in the southeast corner. You can see the red. And all of a sudden now you're going to start to see movement. Red lines are every time this person who lives down in that southeast corner is going to another neighborhood. This is dynamic mobility. You can see the timestamp on the top left. We are recording through 24 hours a day, every single place this person goes. What's interesting is that the patterns, well, you don't know Boston probably that well. Logan Airport's up to the sort of upper right-hand corner. But it's interesting that there's a concentration. You can see these are all the neighborhoods you visited, but think of all the neighborhoods that were not visited. In other words, it's a very interesting social structural phenomenon. And we can start to think about the types of neighborhoods visited and how you can put that together. So really then, just hopefully by that little visual, you can imagine that there's at least three things that we can measure in terms of everyday mobility. One is how far are people traveling? So for each person, we can calculate the median distance. We can look at the number of neighborhoods they visited, and we can importantly look at the composition. the first major paper that came out of this project, and by the way, all these papers are available. That's why I'm kind of skimming through a lot of them. I think almost everyone is open access. I can send them to you if you can't get them. But in this paper, we took the 50 largest cities in the United States, and we looked at mobility. This picture here, you can see the blue box is what we determined to be the home neighborhood of a person who lived in Manhattan. This person seems to like Midtown and maybe Southern Manhattan, really doesn't like the Bronx. One visit, maybe 2 to Queens, a couple to Brooklyn's, over there in New Jersey. But you can see highly constricted, so many areas the person does not visit. Right away, you should hopefully start to get the sense that this is a good way to start to think about social isolation. William Julius Wilson was famous in arguing about social isolation in poor neighborhoods, but using these kinds of data, we can actually test that. Now, what did we do? This was in 2014 or so when we started it, and the only data that were available at the time that we used were geocoded tweets. Now, I can talk offline or Q&A about this. We've written a lot on it in terms of validation, methodological reports. We're not arguing it's an exact random sample, but we're arguing that it provides a good signal, which we've since validated, of mobility patterns. What we did is retrieved all visited locations from 8 to 12, from 8 p.m. to 12 from the city's entire commuting zone, and defined that as a home neighborhood. Use density, machine learning, clustering algorithms to define that. And on the right, you can see Manhattan. And this just shows the density of Twitter users. And it's interesting because it maps almost perfectly with the map of population density in New York City. So it suggests we're getting, a pretty good read on it. What we found is that when we're looking at individual travel patterns, interestingly enough, and this was a surprise to us, the number of neighborhoods visited and the median distance traveled did not really vary by race or class in the 50 largest cities. So let me just repeat that, right? You've got this idea that in concentrated poor neighborhoods or African-American neighborhoods, people are socially isolated from the larger culture, the larger world. Well, in fact, people are getting out. People do not just live in their neighborhoods. And by the way, this methodology that we're using here, Twitter, there's other ways you can do it. There's been a history of research going back a while, actually, using time diaries, time budgets. P.O. Wickstrom at the Institute of Criminology is looked at this in his survey. So you can imagine that people can keep diaries. The idea in our project was to try to do it on a much larger scale than you can do in a survey, hence using passive either tracking devices from GPS or in this case, geocoded Twitter. Now, individually, again, as these people traveled, we do not find any differences by race or class in distance or number of neighborhoods. But, and this is a huge but, race trumps class in the types of neighborhoods that are visited. I'll explain this graph. It's pretty simple, but let me just tell you, it's the predicted proportion of visits. These are aggregated city fixed effects across all, basically the US, proportion of visits to white, non-poor neighborhoods. Now we picked that as an illustrative example of Wilson's kind of mainstream neighborhoods, not in a normative sense, just the idea of resources and so forth. So non-poor white neighborhoods. Now, obviously, if you're traveling in a city, it matters how many neighborhoods of any type exist. The red line, these are deviations from the composition of the city. So to make it simple, if there are 20% of the neighborhoods in a city are non-poor white neighborhoods, then in a world of equality, right, or randomness, you would visit 20%. So we just deviated it from the composition. So the red line is the line of equality. Basically what you can see is, and then it's just the residential neighborhood type, non-poor white from non-poor white neighborhoods are basically, quote, over visiting by quite a bit neighborhoods of their own type. Not poor whites are kind of close to equality, but they're actually distant, significantly distant from non-poor whites as well. So there is an white class divide here. But the big story is Black and Hispanic neighborhoods are just way, way, way below. If you add it up, 30, like almost like, let's say 0.3 below the equality line, plus 1, 2, you know, they're about 40 or so percentage points different. And moreover, if you compare the lines at the bottom down here with my cursor, those from non-poor Black neighborhoods and those from poor Black neighborhoods are really no different in terms of their visitation, which is quite remarkable, actually. What it's saying is that race is the fundamental driving feature in social segregation. Boston Globe did a piece on this and other studies. They had a little graphic about where white people go and where Black people go. I think it captures the fact that there's a kind of social context segregation that's going on that we didn't quite realize. So based on that paper, then, we've published a number of other papers, really because I think they motivate a new set of questions. So one was a more theoretical paper I published in Urban Studies on neighborhood effects and beyond, explaining the paradox of inequality in the changing American metropolis. The paradox is that, in part, right, we have an increasingly diverse society. It's true in Europe, it's true in most places. And yet, what we're seeing is increases in inequality and almost hidden, at least before many of these studies, this kind of social segregation as well in the face of this increasing diversification. So we're trying to get this idea of everyday movement, which accounts, by the way, for not any one phenomenon. This is work, shopping, leisure, visits to friends and family, social contact. It's not just about commuting, it's about every single movement. And in a paper in Sociological Methods and Research, we took a formal network approach and conceptualized not just individual movements, but then we used all the movements to do two things: to conceptualize neighborhoods as vertices, that is nodes, and then the connections between them, or edges, is the travel between them. And we can weight those edges by the volume of travel. So what we did in that paper was create two measures, which I think are kind of interesting. I'm not going to get into the math here or details, but I think you'll conceptually understand it. One is concentrated mobility index. The way to understand this is the extent to which travels, or if people leave their neighborhood, are concentrated in particular neighborhoods of the city, like if everyone's going to the same place. This fits sort of the idea of hubs or public commons. I mean, in Boston, we have what's called the commons, right? Where people at least are supposed to hang out together. Eli Anderson, the sociologist, has written about the cosmopolitan canopy in Philadelphia. Using the Gini index, we can operationalize that. Secondly, we define what we call the equitable mobility index. The way to think about this is how much a mobility network, that is the ties between, it's a matrix of every neighborhood by every other neighborhood. In this case, it's a block group, by the way, so we're going as micro as we can. It's a matrix of every block group by every other block group, and how much would you need to change the observed mobility network to create an evenly connected one? And we use the Hamming distance measure to create that. These are distinct measures, and in those papers we give the procedures and maps and some findings. We also showed in a paper came out last year that the combination of low equitable mobility and low hubs, if you will, so where people are really kind of where cities are cleaved, that is to say, it's almost like people aren't meeting in common places, and they really aren't traveling across the neighborhoods of the city in any kind of equitable way. I think Detroit was one of the highest on that score, tend to be higher in violence. And in a recent paper in Urban Studies, Jennifer Candepan, postdoc here, and Mario Small and Nolan, who was on the original paper, created measures of racial segregation in everyday mobility at the city level. So we can now compare census-based measures of segregation with mobility-based measures of segregation. We published those measures. The actual measures are available as an appendix, and it's not the same thing. Sure, it's correlated in highly segregated cities. There's more mobility-based racial segregation, but there's distinctness. And unfortunately, we find that the racial segregation mobility seems to drive in large part from the size of the minority populations as a key predictor. But now I want to move on to, or down a little bit to the neighborhood level of analysis and talk about the concept of triple disadvantage. Neighborhood networks of everyday urban mobility and violence in American cities. Now, these use the same underlying data, although we will expand them, to look at neighborhood disadvantage in a way that goes beyond the traditional emphasis on residential disadvantage. Now, to fix the theoretical ideas, let me show you a sort of stylistic city or a toy city here that will hopefully round out the idea. So imagine three types of neighborhoods: disadvantaged, middle class, and advantaged. Top left is a disadvantaged neighborhood, neighborhood A. The arrows represent the mobility connections between them. Now, this is simplified, but what you'll notice in this figure is that triple disadvantage is defined as such because that disadvantaged neighborhood is visited by only other disadvantaged neighborhoods and visits only other disadvantaged neighborhoods. Now, you can get all kinds of different combinations here. Out disadvantaged, for example, where you have a middle class neighborhood but has visitation to lower income neighborhoods and so on and so forth. This isn't just about the poor. We also are talking about triple advantage or isolated affluence, where neighborhoods are rich, let's say, and guess what? They only visit other rich neighborhoods and only people they let in. Well, of course, maybe there's gates at the community. In some communities, of course, there are, but the flows in are disproportionately advantaged. Now, in a real city, there's going to be flows across all types, and we can weight by the actual distributions, which in fact we do. And in the paper, we have a section and a test on what the mechanisms might be that would connect triple disadvantage to violence, including, for example, increases in interpersonal friction, the regard to flows into a neighborhood. Roger Gould in Collision of Wills, Eli Anderson have written about status, conflict, symmetric relations, particularly among the poor and in stranger settings in public. Let's talk about drug trafficking and the flow of guns across neighborhoods. I'm not going to get into that today. I wanted to present the main idea here, but we have a theory of both the triple disadvantage and triple advantage, and then potential mechanisms that may explain it. And we do a mediation sketch in the analysis. Just a quick show you here that neighborhood disadvantage on the left and triple on the right. If you study this, and these are all published, we've actually published maps and you can download them for every city in the United States. It varies a lot across cities. This is one where it's a little bit more highly related, but you can see that, for example, in Brooklyn and Queens, especially, the dense concentration of poverty tends to thin out, and you get a different picture of which neighborhoods are really disadvantaged, whereas the Bronx kind of stays highly disadvantaged. And these differences make a difference, and we show the added value of triple disadvantage over simple neighborhood disadvantage. And in predicting neighborhood homicide, for example, this is from the ASR article, the boxed line at the top, especially at the high end, predicts much higher rates of homicide, about a 35% increase in the 99 to 1% distribution if you just look at the gaps. To give you another feel for it, bringing in the Chicago theme, this is a paper coming out in the University of Chicago Law Review, where we updated it to look at, first of all, one city, and sort of replicated this on the homicide rates for 2014-15. On the right, homicides 2019 to 2020. This includes, by the way, the 50% increase in homicide that's occurred over the last few years. I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm just struck, and that's, I guess, why I got Enduring Neighborhood Effect in the title of my book. it is an incredibly stable structure of both triple disadvantage and homicide. In fact, the prediction here is from our measures of triple disadvantage in 2014 to the homicide rate in 1920. It's very strong. And similarly to other cities, we show an added value of neighborhood disadvantage. This is a predicted, adjusted, sort of multivariate analysis of the violent crime rate. Is a function of disadvantage, residential disadvantage, which is the straight, solid black line at the bottom, and then the dashed line is triple disadvantage with confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. So you can see both at the low and the high ends, the sharper slope, if you will, a prediction of violence from triple disadvantage. Okay, I'm flying through this, but if you think about it, triple disadvantage is something that we argue this in the ASR paper, has consequences, theoretical implications for racial inequality. What I will say is that the ratio of poor to non-poor is, we know it's higher in African-American neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. But when you look at triple disadvantage, it's way more unequal. In other words, that it's disadvantage that's hidden when you just look at residential disadvantage. I think it's something like 10 to 1 for just straight out neighborhood poverty, the rate for blacks to whites. But when you look at triple disadvantage, it's something like 30 to 1. We talk about gentrification, we talk about other phenomenon, but in terms of health, and I know this is a health audience, COVID. Well, contact matters, obviously. So travel patterns should matter. We know travel patterns were reduced during COVID, but we measured triple disadvantage just before the COVID wave, so it wouldn't be confounded or be endogenous to the travel patterns induced. And we theorized a number of things, including going back to collective efficacy, the idea that in triple disadvantaged neighborhoods, low collective efficacy neighborhoods, there are likely to be different norms about masking, different resources with regard to testing, virus testing. I noticed that in my own neighborhood when COVID hit, it was really shocking to me how many people were masking in public, and there was sort of a shaming thing going on. And you go to some other neighborhoods and you didn't see that. I think that's a real thing. So just to give you a quick feel for this, this is brand new. We gathered the data we could find at the block group level, which was only in Wisconsin, San Francisco, and King County, Seattle. What's nice about that is that, you kind of got this rural, kind of Republican-ish, Midwestern state, San Francisco and King County. We used cell phone data this time, because I know some of you out there are thinking, oh my God, Twitter. I mean, I'm not even on Twitter. So we have to validate it. We did, I can show you that. We created measures using both Twitter and SafeGraph. We validated them over time. I can show you those graphs in Q&A if you want. But the point is, here we used 2019 measures just before COVID started, using the same methodology based on cell phone tracking, looking at in-degree disadvantage and out degree. And in a paper coming out in Science Advances, actually Friday, we show inequality, neighborhood inequality based on triple disadvantage is really highly predictive. And without getting into the details here, basically what we found is that in King County, basically in San Francisco and Seattle, affluence, this is the bottom part here, the blue and gray lines with the confidence intervals, compared to the middle disadvantage. So basically we did the middle two quartiles as reference groups, were very protective, not so much, or not at all really in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, it was more low disadvantage. So it's really, quite remarkable about how these things vary. So in other words, if you look at, basically what you're seeing is sort of both ends of the distribution, in other words, are mattering here. And where you have low sort of protective of mobility disadvantage is more so in Seattle. And then high mobility-based disadvantage, sorry, I misspoke earlier, are quite different. Bottom line is, when you look across all three, it's a strong prediction. So what am I going to conclude here? And then I want to just say a little bit about the Life Course project. I think that the mobility-based connectedness provides a new perspective on city-level social integration. And what I mean by that is literally at the city or macro level. We could think about it as societal level as well, but Peter Blau and others have argued that while social contact does not guarantee social integration, it's a necessary ingredient. And I think what we've all learned from the pandemic is that isolation is very detrimental to integration. It's also useful at the neighborhood level, and in particular, neighborhood triple disadvantage, we think, is an independent predictor. I didn't say cause, I can say more about that. We did lots of robustness tests, and I think arguably one could argue it's a cause, but in any case, both crime and health are implicated in neighborhood triple disadvantage, and for good theoretical reasons in terms of the mechanisms that I started to elucidate. And really then, and this might be useful for health folks, it provides a kind of comparative econometrics for public health and well-being more generally. What I mean by that is, with the advent of all these new sources of data, we can now, this is something we couldn't even have done a year ago. These are now becoming available globally. I would argue that almost any city in the world, one can create these metrics. They can be used as signals, both in terms of really trying to understand communities at risk in terms of events, either as they're happening or in terms of prediction and planning. We have a paper coming out in a handbook of comparative urban studies where we lay out the theoretical framework for this a little bit more in a global perspective that may be of interest to folks. It's not out yet, be happy to supply it. Okay, just, and I think I'm keeping on time here, so 5 minutes left. Project in Human Development, Chicago Neighborhoods. It has a developmental theme. I don't want you to think that it's just all about neighborhoods. I know I kind of have a affinity for the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, but I'm deeply invested in the longitudinal study of lives, and in particular, what the PHDCN, in terms of its recent data collections, has allowed me to do, and with my colleagues, is to really think about the classic sociological question that C. Wright Mills put forth, what he called the sociological imagination. And that's the linking of individual lives or biography with history and social structure. And so in a series of papers, we've tried to do that. And let me just sketch you what that looks like in 5 minutes. And again, these papers are all available, open access, and happy to share them with you. But recall the design. Again, this is the idea that you have people at the same ages in different historical moments. Well, this provides a way to start to look at age, period, and cohort effects. I'm not a demographer. I'm not interested in separating the three, but I am interested in, as the PHDCN was at the beginning, in the interaction of human development and social change. Now, cohorts can differ, so you would expect cohorts to differ if in their early childhood they're exposed to different criminogenic characteristics, and indeed they are. If you just take the younger cohorts, remember, one cohort was born in 1995, a very unique moment. Crime was plummeting as they were growing up, whereas the older cohorts came up through much higher rates of violence. As you can see, the dark is the older cohorts, higher murder rates when they were young, robbery rates, weapon rates, exposed to more lead, grew up in more high poverty neighborhoods. Their parents were more likely to be arrested. Parents were less likely to have university degrees. So this is sort of fits with a standard compositional argument that says, hey, these cohorts are going to differ and that's it. But I'm interested in a different kind, not a cohort effect of that sort, but rather the interaction of aging and period, which we can do. And the argument here is the identification of aging and their interaction with period can be done if we can rule out plausibly the individual differences, family differences, and neighborhood differences in terms of early life characteristics, which we can do, I would argue, because we measure what matters in the PHDCN. It's got incredible density of measurement on disposition, demographics, family structure, family troubles. I mean, right down to whether the grandmother was arrested, aunt, uncle, siblings, parent depression, drug use. And I'm presenting this too because some of you may use these data for other purposes. It's a very dense measurement structure. It's got physical and social structure. I mentioned collective efficacy, but also alcohol and lead exposure. And we can control for these things and look at aging and arrest in this case in the following way. Many of you are probably familiar with the age crime curve, in this case, the age arrest curve, which means that in adolescence, arrest peaks and then declines. But this specific graph from the accelerated longitudinal design allows us to put years on those ages. In other words, to look at the younger cohort who's peaking at age 20, let's say, but that's in 2016 compared to maybe 2000 or so for the older cohort. So they're coming of age in very different worlds. Now, these lines are very different in the magnitude, hugely different, right? I mean, over a factor of 2. Why is that? Well, one argument analytically is it's because these cohorts differed on the factors I showed you before. I'm going to argue that it's not. And then once you adjust for them, this is a classic sort of Norman Ryder example of differentiation by cohorts in terms of social change. That is to say, once we adjust, that difference, in this case, still about a doubling, it's reduced somewhat. Oops. It's reduced somewhat from the left-hand graph, but this difference is a function of differential social change. Now, in the AJS paper, we go to great lengths to look at the different changes that were occurring at this very time, and they're counterintuitive. I mean, we know about broken windows policing and aggressive policing, but actually, for example, arrests were plummeting for disorder and drug arrests only when the younger cohort was coming of age, which drives about 50% of the difference. So we're really taking into account broader social changes and criminal justice changes. 2 other things. It's not that individual differences are unimportant. No, at all. We look at the interaction of individual differences and arrest. Disadvantage, of course, is a classic variable in criminology. And what you can see here is the age crime curve, and here's disadvantage, and then advantage on the right. Now, advantage and disadvantage are different, but actually it matters when. This is quite remarkable that the younger cohort in the 1990s, the disadvantage actually and the advantage narrows. The difference is really the disadvantage. In other words, it was the disadvantaged older cohorts in the 80s and 90s that were really hammered, and that by the later cohorts, the consequences of disadvantage were muted. And one final example of how this works and how I think it's pretty interesting, you know, self-control is a huge construct in psychology, developmental criminology. And yes, low self-control is related to higher rates of arrest. You can see it comparing the left and the right. However, what I find interesting, it's like, is the glass half full or the glass half empty? Cohort and social change differences are so great that the high self-control kids of one generation, that is the older cohort kids, are rendered essentially equivalent to the low self-control children of another generation. I think that's quite remarkable. yes, individual differences matter. We clearly show it. We validate the measures. But the meaning or the interpretation that we place on what self-control means has to be understood in the context of history. So I'm going to skip over that and just end because I think I'm 40 minutes. I just think we need to rethink our notions of risk factors. It's not that they're unimportant, but in this case, cohort differences are dominating them, and they're interacting with them. And this wreaks havoc on all kinds of things. There's cohort bias and prediction, right? I mean, if you're training your sample on an older cohort, which many criminal justice agencies do, it's going to produce error. And we show that in some of our ongoing work. The impact of arrest is historically interacting with social disadvantage and neighborhood poverty. But I'm going to stop there because I've gone through my time and I want to give a chance for questions. And the idea, again, was to show you a suite of findings at both the neighborhood and macro life course perspective. Happy to take questions, happy to send you papers and point you to data sources, again, many of which are available and can be downloaded. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Robert. So we're going to pause the recording there. I think thank you very much to Robert for his time and for giving his time so graciously and giving the lecture today. We really appreciate it. I've got a lot out of it, and I hope that everyone else has too.
Oh, so sure. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And as I mentioned, I'm serious. I'm happy to answer any other questions. I'm sorry if there wasn't time. If you want to shoot me an email, or the paper's available on my website, or most of them should be freely accessed. And be happy to hear ideas because, as I said, there's a lot of things that we just don't have time to do, but would love to advise or work on some of these other things. I know Julie was going to ask a question. I'm thinking it was about the time daily differences too in routine activities, which is really an important issue that we're working on as well. So keep the questions coming.
Super, thank you. And then just one last thing, after 2 years of no Bradford Hill seminars, we've got another one next week in short order. So please join us next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. You can find details of that on the website. Here we go, we've got details here. Epidemiology and control of COVID-19 in Hong Kong next Wednesday at 1. So please do join us for the next Bradford Hill seminar. Register in advance. Thank you very much.